Welcome to As I Live and Grieve, a podcast that tells the truth about how hard this is. We're glad you joined us today. We know how hard it is to lose someone you love and how well-intentioned friends and family try so hard to comfort us. We created this podcast to provide you with comfort, knowledge, and support. We are grief advocates, not professionals, not licensed therapists. We are you.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back again. So excited for our guest today. It's a topic that we've touched on briefly, but I think today we have such an excellent resource. Jenny Lisk is with us today. Hi, Jenny. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Kathy. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Jenny, before we get started with questions and everything, would you just give our listeners a bit of your background, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, perhaps the shortest version is I'm a widowed parent. And I'm a podcaster and an author. My husband Dennis got sick 7 years ago right now. We were in the middle of all of this. And it was glioblastoma, which is a very aggressive form of brain cancer. And our kids at the time were 9. Well, they were 8 and 10 when he was diagnosed. And by the time he died 8 months later, they were 9 and 11. And I found one of the hardest things, I became a widow at the age of 43, but trying to figure out, how do I do this new job of being a widowed parent? Because it seemed to me to be two different distinct things, right? There's like me and my grief. And then there's also, now I'm a parent to grieving children. And so that's really what set me on this course and starting the podcast, which I'm sure we'll get into that and the book that I wrote. And it's hard to believe it was 7 years ago right now that we were in the middle of, I think there was 1 week when we went to the emergency room 4 or 5 times in the same week. Like, it was just crazy. And we can talk about that too. But yeah, it's been quite a journey.
I'm sure it has. So many times we think about just grieving ourselves. But when children are introduced, as you say, it's added complexity to it. And you have 2 children, so I would think for you it was threefold, because each of your children are going to handle it differently as well.
Well, that is a very interesting point. It's something I didn't fully appreciate before I started learning about this, right? Is that when you have multiple kids, you have multiple experiences of grief.
Right.
And even though we all lost the same person, right? His name was Dennis. We have very different experiences. I lost a spouse. They lost a dad at a young age. And I have no idea what it's like to lose a parent at 9 or 11, or actually even now, my parents are both still alive, but certainly not what it's like to lose one at that age. And that has been interesting. And it's one of the reasons on my show I interview, lots of different types of people, but one kind of category of guests is people who are now adults and they lost a parent when they themselves were 3 or 12 or 19 or whatever young age. And now they're 25, 35, 45 and reflecting on what that was like for them growing up, right? I think it helps me and helps my listeners, most importantly, get some sense of what this experience is like for kids who lose a parent. And it's not like listening to other people's stories will tell me exactly what my kids are going through, but it helps give me ideas of things I wouldn't have thought about, of, what they might be thinking about, what might be issues and things like that.
Absolutely. And I find that with podcasting as well, that every guest I have, it may be an experience that I have never had myself, but by listening to them, I get little pieces, little tidbits here and there that adds to my own awareness of grief as a whole, and I hope allows me to be better able to help others as well, help them understand and be supportive for them. But certainly we know ourselves that everybody's experience is different, so it would be only natural that within a family, the more people you have, each one is going to experience grief differently. Now, you and I have parallels in that my husband died 4.5 years ago, also of a glioblastoma.
Oh, wow.
So I can fully appreciate that. And I remember the day in the hospital when we got the actual diagnosis. And the doctor said to us, he said, there are 3 things I can tell you about glioblastomas. The first is that it's an extremely aggressive type of cancer. The second is that it's different for every person that has a glioblastoma. And the third is there's no cure.
Yep.
And those are the words that I experienced that day. I never, until I saw your book, I never heard the term future widow.
Ah.
But I remember going through those thoughts and emotions almost daily while Tom was being cared for here and there. And as you did, a number of trips to the emergency room and a number of falls at home and a number of experimental treatments and everything like that. It's just, it's incredible. But yet to know that under the surface of all that, I was thinking myself, what do I need to do to prepare myself?
Mm-hmm.
But again, I had only myself
Mm.
to prepare because, well, Tom and I were married later in life, so we had a blended family. My kids had a relationship with Tom, but it certainly wasn't as close as a biological dad would have been. His kids, of course, had a relationship with him as a dad, but they were estranged for a while, for a period of time, so that was different. So, can you kind of elaborate a little bit for us, kind of what was going on with your family when you received the diagnosis, as you worked through the illness, and then the grief afterward, after he died?
Yeah, the diagnosis was so out of the blue. It was shocking, really. I mean, he was totally fine. We had a normal kind of family life, right? Our kids were in, let's see, 5th grade and 2nd grade. We had, we each had jobs, we had a house, and we had kids' activities and scouts and soccer and just stuff, right? And all of a sudden, he said he was feeling a little bit dizzy. And, dizzy, that doesn't really seem like it's cause for, you're not going to run to the emergency room because you're dizzy. You're probably not even going to run to urgent care. I mean, you're dizzy. Maybe call your doctor and have a chat, right? Maybe watch your symptoms over some days or whatever. And it was the strangest thing. And it turned out that was the first sign of in his case, of his glioblastoma. And combined with, pretty quickly, he started getting some cognitive confusion. And at first, and like you said, it impacts people differently depending on where in the brain it is and such. And a friend of mine, her husband also had died of glioblastoma a few years prior, and his affected him totally differently. He went blind. It was on his optic nerve. And in this case, it was cognitive confusion. And so little things I started noticing, right, where I would say something and he didn't seem to understand, but then he was totally fine. And then I'm second guessing myself, right? Am I reading too much into the situation? Like, am I imagining these reactions? No, it got worse pretty rapidly, and we went into his primary care doctor. And I was thinking he had just started a minor kind of medication for an unrelated issue, and I had been Googling, of course, and one of the rare side effects was cognitive confusion. It wasn't a main side effect or even but it was on the list, right? So I'm like, okay, that's the problem. Just change the medicine and he'll be fine.
Sure.
Well, the doctor says, let's get an MRI of your brain. And at the end of the MRI hour, normally they send you home, right? And they call you.
Right.
But they said, actually go back upstairs. The doctor wants to see you. And it was already like, after 5 o'clock. And the doctor says, well, I don't want to scare you. He said, there's something really wrong with your brain. I don't want to scare you. It might be glioblastoma. Meanwhile, I'm like, glioblastoma? Like, I never heard that word before, right?
Right.
You need to go see the neurosurgeon tomorrow. And we see the neurosurgeon the next day, and he says, we're doing surgery the following day. So we went from everything was perfectly fine to within 2 weeks, your brain's being cut open, right?
Right.
And I remember sitting there in the primary care doctor's office on the little visitor's bench in his office, like, lean back, close my eyes, look up at the ceiling. And I'm like, are we actually having this conversation? Like, is this just like made up? Kind of like somebody wake me up from this bad dream, right? Right. And that was the start of it. And, as you said, we had kids who at the time were 8 and 10. And, because it was, there was no way for them not to be involved, right? And seeing what was going on. And he was home, and then he was at the hospital, and then he was, home again, and then running off to the ER. And so we had to, because the kids were the ages they weren't quite old enough to stay home by themselves. Every time we had to go someplace, we had to call someone to come over to the house or to send them to a friend's house. And in fact, I remember the time you mentioned falls, several months into this, actually probably 6 months into this, Dennis fell in the shower. And we were supposed to have a shower stool in the shower. Like, PT
Right.
or somebody, OT had brought over a shower stool. Well, he wasn't using the shower stool. He didn't remember that he was supposed to use it. So we had agreed that it would be more dangerous to have a stool in there that wasn't going to get used and get tripped over. So we took the stool out. It was like 5 a.m, and he woke up in the shower. And I'm like, 5 a.m, and he thinks he's getting ready for work, right? We kind of had this constant thing. He would sometimes get dressed, put his badge in his pocket, put his shoes on. I'm like, where are you going, right? He hadn't worked in months. So he's taking a shower, and I'm sitting there on the edge of the bed, like my eyes half closed, saying, all right, I'll just stay awake, make sure he's safe. All of a sudden, I hear this thud, right? And so I run in there, and he had slipped and fallen, and the water's still on. And I'm thinking, now what do I do? Right? Like, I wasn't sure that I could lift him. He was, wet and slippery. But even if I could have, I wasn't sure I should, because I wasn't sure how injured he was.
Right.
And it was, like I said, it was 5 a.m. on a school day. So I called 911. And I said, my husband has fallen in the shower. But here's the backstory. He's a brain cancer patient, all these things. This isn't just like an ordinary slip and fall. What should I do? And they said, well, we'll send over the paramedics, right? And so then I'm thinking, my 2 kids are asleep in their 2 bedrooms. I don't want them to wake up to paramedics rushing into the house and freak out, right? So I have to go wake up the kids and tell them. So I woke them up one at a time, and I said, Dad's okay, but he fell. The paramedics will be here in a few minutes. I wanted to let you guys know. And meanwhile, I had called my parents. And so I said, Grandma and Grandpa are on the way over. Because, this is an example, right, where we then had to go to the ER at 5 a.m.
Sure.
And now the kids needed to go to school, and they needed someone with them. I guess I could have put him on the ambulance by himself to the hospital, except that I always had to be there because he would tell the doctors the wrong things.
You were his advocate.
Well, that, and also the person who had the story, right? Because he would tell, like, I remember one ER doctor said, normally you talk to the patient, especially if they're an adult, right? So the doctor says to my husband, oh, so, why are you here or something? And he said, well, I think I have cancer. And the doctor's like, oh, what kind of cancer do you have? And he's like, oh, I think it's liver cancer. And I'm like standing behind the bed where my husband can't see me. I'm like waving my hands. Now listeners can't see me. I'm waving my hands saying, no. Like, you need to ask me the questions. If you need you can ask him whatever you want, but if you need the facts, you need to ask me. Right.
Right.
And so I had to go with him to the hospital. And so I had to call my parents, wake them up. They rushed over. Fortunately, they live close by. Mm-hmm. And then the kids, of course, had to go off to school, just knowing that their dad now was at the hospital and their mom was at the hospital with them. And I had to email the teachers from my phone in the hospital, in the ambulance while I'm driving, to say, this is what happened this morning. The kids are coming to school, but, they're probably going to be freaked out.
Right.
And that's just one example of, the extra complexity logistically, but also emotionally, right? When there's kids involved in a situation like this.
Right. And you're worried about 3 people.
Mm-hmm.
You're probably not worried about yourself, although we most often should be. But you were worried about 3 people, but you're only one person.
Right. Yeah.
And you went where you felt the priority and the greatest need was, but that doesn't stop you from being so worried and concerned for the other 2.
Yeah.
And you dealt with that, and every day, every minute of your day, probably.
Oh, yeah. And, and I was in effect a single parent instantly, right? Because of his cognitive confusion and his medical issues, he wasn't taking a parenting role at all, either in terms of logistics of like taking the kids to school or in terms of, parentally interacting with kids, right? I mean, he was, and the times he was home at the end, he was bedridden for a few months and he couldn't do anything. He was confused. In fact, I remember a time when my daughter had this gigantic stuffed dog. You know how IKEA has stuffed animals and some of them are like big? And there was a time period when we go to IKEA and every time she goes, I want a big stuffed animal, right? So she had this big stuffed dog that looked like a prior dog that we had.
Right.
She'd had it for a while, so the inside, fluffy stuff was getting compressed. So
Right.
she had asked me if she could cut open the dog and put in some more stuffing. But she asked me this in the same room where Dad was there,
Okay.
and he thought she was cutting open the actual dog. And
Oh.
he was like, "No, you can't cut open." And actually, so our previous dog who had died, her name was Martha. And so the stuffed dog had been named Martha after Martha, the real dog.
Right.
So she says,
Right.
"Can I cut open Martha and add stuffing?" And he was like, "No, you
Oh.
can't. You can't cut her open." Like, and it took me a while to figure out that he
What?
actually was concerned that she was going to do like home surgery on a real dog or something crazy like that. Of course, she
Right.
wasn't,
Right.
right? And so, but this is kind of an example where he wasn't parenting, right? He was just confused about stuff.
Right.
So yeah, so to your point, right? I was, you kind of dealing with stuff on multiple levels, and one level is logistics. Unfortunately, I had the logistics pretty well covered because I had so many people helping me. So multiple family members living close by, and a very tight knit community of school families and neighbors who pitched in, whether it's bringing food, carpooling the kids, doing all the logistical stuff, right? So I had those things covered.
Right.
The other aspect, though, that I write about this in Future Widow in my book, I didn't know how important it was to try to also cover the emotional bases as we went along, right? So in some respects, like where I felt like everything was kind of okay, right? What am I trying to say here? Like, here's an example. We played one time, the children's game, Sorry, board game. We
Right.
tried to we try to look for things to
Uh-huh.
do as a family, right? There was no bucket list, like, let's go do stuff, right? So what could we do? We could watch
Right.
movies, and we could maybe kind of play a simple card game or board game. Not really. He needed a lot of help, but it's something to pass the time, right? So we were trying to play Sorry.
Right.
And, Megan is like 8, maybe she's 9 by this time. And he was confused about how to play. And so she was coaching him through how to play. The way you would coach your child when you are first teaching a small child how to play a new board game.
Right.
Oh, roll the
Right.
dice, move your pieces here, whatever, right? So
Mhm.
she's like, "Oh, Dad, you got a 4. Do you want to move this piece?" And he's like, "Okay." Do you want me to move it for you? Sure. So she's coaching him through this total role reversal thing,
Right.
right?
Right.
And we were all playing, and it was like a pleasant enough activity, right? We passed the time. Nobody was crying. Everybody, was on the surface okay. And so it was like, okay, now it's on to the next thing. Now it's time for medicine or whatever it's time for next, right?
Right.
Going through. And it was kind of like I had so many balls in the air that it was like, okay, well, phew, that went okay. So let's move on. Well, what I didn't do, I didn't know any better, right? And so I don't beat myself up for it because you can only do what you know. But in hindsight, one of the reasons I wanted to add, reflect on things with the book and share the story is layering in like the things that I've learned since then that I wish I had known. So, for example, I wish that I had known to then, after we played that game that day and we had that, check in with my 9-year-old later, right? Maybe when I'm tucking her in bed or maybe the next day, whenever, and be like, "Hey, how was that for you today? That seemed kind of weird. How was that for you?"
Right.
Right? And maybe she would want to talk about it, or maybe she wouldn't want to talk about it. If she wants to talk about it, great. Then I listen, right? And that gives a chance to connect and hear, how she's processing that. If she doesn't want to talk about it, that's okay too, because what I'm doing by asking the question is sending the message that the door is open for
Right.
these kinds of difficult discussions. So maybe she doesn't want to talk about it today, fine. Maybe she wants to talk about it tomorrow or farther down the road. Or maybe she doesn't even want to talk about the plain Sorry, but a different difficult topic is on her mind, right?
Right.
And so what I wish I had known, like I said, I kind of felt like, okay, the logistics are handled,
Right.
if I had been able to have the knowledge to add that extra, like checking in and to start connecting emotionally as we went through it. Because like you said, in most cases, glioblastoma is a death sentence. Now, not always. I was talking to somebody just yesterday who lives here in Seattle, who is a survivor of glioblastoma of 5-6 years. and is
Wow.
cancer-free and doing very well. And I have another friend in Atlanta who had glioblastoma diagnosed like 17 years ago and is still cancer-free.
Oh
I
my.
know. So it's
Oh
crazy that
my.
I know two people because, like you and I know, it's a
Right.
single-digit 5-year survival rate. It's
Yeah.
bad,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But single digits means there are a few that survive.
Right.
But anyway, I knew in my gut he had so many complications, and there was no, like, I just knew it wasn't going to end well.
Exactly.
And
Yep.
so some of the things, like I said, I wish I had known to start opening some of those doors to some of the emotional discussions sooner would have, I think, helped set us up
Right.
in the long run.
Well, so that begs the question, at what point did you think about these?
Mm,
At what point did you start to consider, oh gosh, maybe I should have done this, or maybe I should have done that?
yeah. Well, so after he died, I was trying to figure out, I was like, I got to do something in this widowed parenting space. I don't know what it looks like. I just feel like there's a big gap here. Like, I found books for
Mm-hmm.
myself. I went to Camp Widow, which, if your listeners don't know about that, it's run by Soaring Spirits. It's terrific. It's not camping. It's at a hotel, a fancy hotel. But Camp Widow. I found a therapist for myself, but I wasn't finding resources for my role as a widowed parent. So after
Mm-hmm.
reading all the books I could find, thinking about things, finally somehow I got the idea to start a podcast, the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I started interviewing people. And as I was interviewing these people, some of them are widowed parents themselves, some of them are experts who, run grief centers and
Right.
things. I
Right.
started learning all these things about children's grief and about parenting grieving kids and sharing that with my listeners and then saying, oh, if I had known this or that, right? As I was learning, I was looking back and saying, this would have been helpful. And it helped me figure out how to approach the book because by the time I was done, I was blogging on Caring Bridge throughout the 8 months that he was sick.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time 8 months was over, I had 15,000 words worth of writing documenting, a view in the life of a young family where the dad has terminal illness. And I was like, okay, this seems like the start of a book, but it's not a book yet, right? But it's the start of something. It seems like there's some value in here, but how do I turn it into an actual book? And that's when I started kind of piecing together the ideas and realizing the things I was learning from my podcast guests, I could then layer those into the writing. So, the approach in the book is to I share the original entries, but then with each one I have a reflection, either going further on what was happening, going deeper, sharing things that I wasn't ready to share at the time, and or sharing, things that I have since learned about children's grief that if I had known then, basically sharing in a way to help other people in a similar situation maybe have some information I didn't have that might help things out for them a little bit.
Right. And how do you feel at this point that your kids are doing?
That's an interesting question, and I talk a lot about my experience as a parent, and I feel like their stories are theirs to share. I'm happy to talk about my
Mm-hmm.
role as a parent of them. I'll say we've had ups and downs. I two kids is two different experiences of grief. It's hard, right?
Right.
And one of the things I think that's important to know as a parent or as any grieving person is that grief isn't something that is just like, okay, someone died, now you grieve for X amount of time, and now you're done, and now you go back to, like, I don't know
Right.
what, regular life or something. There's an interesting book, a very interesting book. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it. It's called The After Grief by Hope Edelman.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting. She talks about the long arc of grief of basically lasts throughout the lifetime, and maybe it shows up in
Right.
different ways. It doesn't mean that the way you're grieving, the day after the person dies or the week after or the month after or the year after,
Right.
that's
Right.
not the same as
Right.
10, 20, 30 years out. But that it's always going to be a part of my story and it's always going to be a part of their story that
Mm-hmm.
he died. I became widowed at 43. They lost a dad at 9 and 11. And it's something that, always is going to be part of our story, throughout life. And the other interesting thing that I've learned lots of interesting things, but one other interesting thing is that kids grieve almost multiple times. They have to re-grieve as they go through different developmental milestones. So, a kid who's, let's say, grade school age, they haven't had those brain upgrades associated with puberty yet. Okay. And it's super interesting. So puberty, you normally think of it as like the body changes, but the brain changes are massive in that time period. And so a kid who loses their parent when they're 2 or 5 or 8, they can only grieve to the level of understanding that they have as a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old. And when their brain starts upgrading and they get more understanding, then they almost have to re-grieve all over again the new things they're understanding that they didn't understand before. It's quite interesting. I interviewed a woman whose husband had died when her kids were small. I think her daughter was 2 or 3. And 10 years later, her daughter was 12 or 13. She and her daughter went on a trip to see, I think she called it the dead dad trip or something. And they went and visited the places that he grew up and the places that he'd gone to college and the stuff that was significant in his life, right?
Right.
So from the mom's perspective, her husband had died a decade ago, right? So she had already grieved a lot, and obviously it still affected her. Right. But she had grieved with an adult cognitive understanding all the way along.
Right.
Her daughter was 2 or 3 when the dad died, so she only understood a very small amount. And then as she got older, she understood a little bit more. Well, now when she was 12 or 13, the mom told me that the daughter's grief was fresh, as if her dad had just died. Because she had this 12 or 13-year-old level of understanding that she had never had before. So now she did have a new thing, in a sense, to grieve. And it was jarring for the mom, because the mom's like, he died a decade ago. That's kind of a long time. Right. And so I think that's one of the really interesting things that I didn't know this until I started talking to people. People think, oh, the person died X years ago, so that's in the past. But when you have kids involved, it's called, experts will talk about, grieving as you go through developmental milestones, re-grieving your losses. And I think it's really important that parents and other people around grieving kids are aware that that's a thing and that that's to be expected.
That's so interesting, and I've not heard that before, but it makes a lot of sense. A couple of things you said in your comments there. First of all, the whole re-grieving thing in the fresh grief, but also I have never heard puberty called brain upgrades, and I really like that. I like that phrase, and it lends a whole new perspective to adolescence as well. So your kids are doing okay now. They're doing better.
They are. Yep.
Handling everything well? Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. Yeah, our time is starting to wind down. This time goes so fast. And you mentioned Hope Edelman. She was a guest on our podcast.
Oh, good.
Too.
Good.
And talking about that very book, in fact.
Well, I encourage listeners to pick that up and go back and listen to that discussion you had with her. I'm not sure what you guys talked about, but I'm sure it was a good discussion because she's terrific. And, her original book was Motherless Daughters. And that kind of started her whole national prominence as a grief writer. And I was so happy to see this new book. I think everybody should read it because it's so important.
It was very good. And another book you might like is we had another guest, Mary Frances O'Connor. She wrote a book about your brain on grief. And it talks about why it takes so long sometimes for your mind to get the fact that this person is really gone. And it was great. She has some great analogies, and her chapters start out with either an analogy or a very common sense explanation, and then she goes a little more into the scientific aspect of it. That also was a fascinating book.
That's terrific. Her book is on my nightstand right now.
Really?
But that doesn't mean I've started it yet. I've heard many good things about it, so I'm glad you mentioned it because I've heard so many good things about it. And I do apologize. You might be hearing some rather loud noises in the background here. There's some construction across the street.
I just heard one. It sounded like thunder. Actually.
It does kind of sound like that, doesn't it? But hopefully the listeners won't interfere too much.
Yeah, it's not a problem at all. So it's getting almost time to wind up. And before I do that, I want to stop asking questions. And I want to turn the mic over to you, Jenny, and just talk to our listeners and tell them anything you'd like them to know about your book, your new book, your website, resources you have. Just, the mic is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you. My website is at jennylisk.com, and I have a ton of resources there for widowed parents. So I'd encourage listeners to check that out. And If you are someone who's listening who's not a widowed parent, but you have a widowed parent, or actually really any grieving person in your life, I've also put together a ton of resources for grief allies. And so if you go to griefallies.com, I've got this like whole free thing you can download with what to say, what not to say, tips for ways to help. Here's a tip. Ideally, try not to say, let me know if I can do anything to help. Ideally, try to be specific in your offer, but I expand on that in great detail. So I'd encourage listeners to check that out because I don't know if this has happened to you, but after I lost my husband, people started reaching out to me and saying, my neighbor's wife died, my colleague's husband died, they have these 2 little kids, what can I do, right? And so I realized I should put together information for them. Griefallies.com I think is a good resource for people who are looking to figure out how they can be a good ally and support their friends. And listen to the podcast. If you know a widowed parent, please tell them about it, because there are not a lot, I think, of resources specifically for widowed parents. Help me spread the word.
I think you're absolutely correct on that, because I think even the phrase widowed parent is not a common phrase, and it should be. I'm going to start using it more when it applies, because it's a perfect phrase for that situation. And it's not that we forget about it, but we often are not thinking about that when someone dies. We're not thinking about that aspect of the grief for the remaining parent and what they're going to have to go through, not only to try to manage their own grief, but to try to help their children as well manage theirs.
Yeah. And far too often you hear people say, oh, kids are resilient, kind of dismissing that it would be much of an issue. And I think people are starting to realize that that's not necessarily the case. When I hear people say that, I usually think, well, maybe, right? Like some kids, almost bounce back. I'm using air quotes here, without much intervention, but most kids could use some kind of grief support. And that's one of the things I didn't fully understand either, that, grief support is generally helpful. Anybody who's had a major loss like this, losing a parent as a child is one of the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And, one of the people I interviewed says that, too often people think that kids are like a bouncy ball that just bounces right back. And she likes to think of them like a basketball. Like basketballs bounce, but they need a little support to bounce. Right. And I think that that's a good analogy to think of, supporting kids, I think, is important right now with the pandemic. We have about 250,000 more kids in this country who lost a parent to COVID, plus all the kids who've lost parents to every other cause and continue to do so. And I think they need support. And I think that their surviving parents, the widowed parents, need support in supporting their own children. And so that's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, and why I'm so glad to come on and talk to your listeners today.
Well, and you may have to come back and talk a little bit more about the Grief Allies aspect of it.
Absolutely.
That's something I think everybody can use a little bit of help with, because we just don't know what to say.
Yep.
Or even when to say.
Yeah. I will send you,
and when not.
Yeah, I'll send you my work on that, and have a look, and I'd be happy to come back on and talk about that if you'd like.
Super. Absolutely, I'm going to take you up on that.
Great.
Okay, listeners, it's time for us to wrap up. Unfortunately, I could go on and chat with Jenny longer, so we'll just have to have her back. I do have a copy of your book. I haven't read it yet, I confess, because I have a stack of books on my nightstand as well. And they all have to do with grief, but there are getting to be more and more books out there now, and there are some wonderful resources out there by some wonderful authors. So, listeners, I hope you have found this topic fascinating, and I hope that not only do you want to learn more and you'll go to Jenny's website, but you will also get a copy of her book. It's a memoir, but in that memoir, there has to be so many resources and so many ideas. And even if it's not you in that situation, maybe you know someone, or I almost guarantee, if not today, someday that information will come in very handy. As always, we remind our listeners, too, to take care of yourselves. Self-care is really, really critical when you're grieving. It's about the only way you're going to be able to put one foot in front of the other every day, and that's just what we need to do. To stay well, find some happiness, find a smile in there somewhere, and we'll catch you next week as we all continue to live and grieve.
Thank you so much for listening with us today. Do you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, or do you have a question from one of our episodes? Please email us at info@asiliveandgrieve.com and let us know. We hope you will find a moment to leave a review, send an email, and share with others. Join us next time as we continue to live and grieve together.